and welcome to this month's Self-Build Hour. I'm Jenny Chandela. I'm your host, architect, and head of our Swindon office at AC Architects. And I'm really delighted to be joined today by Rachael O'Donnell from our Scotland office to talk about contract admin. And just a quick reminder about Self-Build Hour and some of the logistics. So this was created so that we would be able to bring to you every month in the convenience of your home or office or wherever it is that you're watching from today, a deep dive topic with an expert on that subject matter. So we've got the live presentation that's going on now, and what that does for you is it allows you to type questions directly into the Q&A function. You can type those in at any point during the presentation, and after the presentation, Rachael and I will just be having a quick discussion so we can go over some of those queries for you. If you don't have the Q&A function, because I'm aware some of you may not, feel free to put it in the chat. I'll check both of those. It will be recorded today, so we've got an amazing library of these self-build hours online that you can look at through at a different time that's either more convenient for you, or whenever you think, oh, I think they talked about that in a previous self-build hour and I don't quite remember the details. So those are always available for you to come back and have a look at. So as I said, today we are going to be talking about contract administration. It is a topic that I think is confusing to a lot of self-builders. So it's fantastic that we're looking at it today. It is something that really bridges that legal gap between the design side of things and moving into construction and how you manage everything that is supposed to be happening in your project from really a contractual standpoint. So we're really pleased today to be joined by Rachael. As I've mentioned, she is a chartered architect and she is with us at AC Architects in our Scotland office. She's been with us since 2020, and she's really been heavily involved in a huge wide range of residential self-build projects. She's really meticulous in her approach, which makes her excellent for helping you understand that building process and sort of guide you through the complexities of contract admin. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Rachael.
Hi there. I'll just share my screen. Bear with.
That's fantastic.
Perfect. That's great. My name is Rachael. I handle the kind of day-to-day running of the contractual elements that we handle here at ACA. And today's talk is just to get you more acquainted with what it entails and why it can matter to you and how it can be utilized. So it's providing that kind of additional context to this kind of daunting aspect as you get into your building process. So what is contract admin and why does it matter? I mean, you go through all of the excitement of the design process, and especially for self-builders, you guys are very involved with that. But getting into the construction side of things can feel quite daunting. It can be pressure filled, and there's a lot of money involved in this aspect, and it can progress quite fast. So contract admin can be a really useful management tool to protect that investment. And it's not as if it can be quite legally intensive, but it does also help to preserve working relationships. It is not about catching the contractor out or you're looking for pitfalls. It's just about providing the parameters within this agreement that you've made between yourself and the contractor, with an agent working fairly and adequately throughout this process in a manner to try and achieve that the smoothest way possible. So it's not adversarial. It provides that transparency. It provides that clarity, and it doesn't always protect the build. It doesn't guarantee a perfect build, but it definitely de-risks things. and it gives everybody a fair process. So, and that's from a client and a main contractor point of view as well. This administration helps manage the scope, cost, time, and how any kind of variation within that unfolds. So what I hope to achieve with this talk today is getting you familiar with the practicalities of a contract, understanding what one might entail, what kind of documentation you bring to the table, what the pre-construction phase looks like a little bit in terms of defining the scope, and then goes into a little bit more about how costs are controlled throughout the construction processes, how you manage change, because obviously as a self-builder, you do want to see how it's unfolding. So you'll be coming onto the site and there might be a little bit of, oh, can we do this? Can we do that? And it's how that's then managed. And then at the end, we can go into a little bit about the different looks that this kind of aspect can entail. So there's many different forms of contracts, there's many different forms of contract admin, and there's many different ways in which you can manage that. So essentially the roadmap for this talk is just going to be me talking about how risks appear, then going into a bit of the contract. Like I said, looking at the money, looking at how variations are dealt with, kind of talking about the initial pressure and that form of dialogue that people tend to get into with many main contractors, even architects as well, what kind of protection this provides you, and again into the procurement. So the power of a contract, that's first and foremost kind of what I want to provide information on, is what does a contract provide you when it comes to a building process? So in our opinion, it's one of the most important protections that you can have when you're building your own home, because it turns what has been agreed to into a clear set rule that can be followed throughout the process. It sets out what the builder is expected to deliver, what information they're working from, how they're going to get paid and when the payments are due, how these changes that occur throughout the process happen, and the process in which those changes get managed and approved. What happens when a project's delayed, there's parameters around that, and how problems, when they arise, because most projects do have an issue that occurs, how they are managed, controlled, and rectified. So without proper contract, many self-builders rely on the trust and conversations they have. They rely on quotes, which maybe they're not quite as detailed. You're not accurately seeing with clarity what is there. So you're working a lot on assumptions. And this can quickly lead to confusion and cost increases, as well as disputes. A lot of self-builders, a lot of people that are just getting into a construction process who haven't had experience before, there'll be pressure on making decisions and uncertainty as to whether or not those decisions are right and have been made too quickly. And it can really, really up the level of uncomfortableness in a situation. So a good construction contract gives you both the client and the contractor clarity. It provides the budget, it provides the specification with the architect involved, and it supports fair decision making. So it helps make things set, and it works in a professionally controlled way, with the management aspect being the CA. So the CA is the contract administrator. They are the person that is responsible to protect the essential agreement. And this doesn't have to be your architect. This can be a QS, this can be your project manager. It just has to be someone that you and the contractor have trust in terms of competency and being able to manage the scope. So a CA is in charge of the fair process. They're not a referee with a whistle, so they're not going to be making demands. All they do is they're updated on a scenario. There's a process in place, we follow that. And if there's anything that's kind of adversarial to what's in the agreement, that's then stated. And then checks and balances essentially go through everything, make sure that whatever is needing done is processed and recorded. So all we do is We review payment requests, we review the scope, we make sure there's a clear record of what's excluded, what meets agreed requirements, what's being substituted, what's being omitted through the dialogue that generally happens in a construction contract. And there is a pre-construction phase where, you know, you're setting this out, but that essentially throughout the contract, that's what's happening. We're tracking the program, we're making sure that we're up to date on what could potentially be causing delay. We are making notes of this, we're recording those, and we're agreeing to what is a suitable extension. And it's the same with costs as well, and I'll go into it further down this PowerPoint. But essentially, we are the record keepers. We go through what's agreed in principle, and if anything then comes into effect, that from either the employer, which is yourself as the client, or the contractor, we are following the parameters that have been set in terms of that specific change. So what makes something successful within a contract and contract administration is the clear roles. A client employer, they're setting the brief and they do make the decisions. So essentially you guys would approve what needs to be done with the guidance of the contract administrator in terms of what's admissible. And it's the same with the contractor. If they have anything that can save people money, it should be first and foremost dealt with as a team in a group setting rather than bypassing any of the agreed parameters. So essentially the client and the employer, they pay, they see the certified sums, but they don't then go to the contractor themselves and try and agree any fundamental changes without the CA's knowledge, because then things become murky. So when problems start, it's usually to do with, for example, if our clients come onto site and they haven't maybe picked a floor specification finish, so they choose a tile and then they ask the contractor, how would a different tile affect things? Without properly assessing the time and cost adjustment, things become muddy. So, you know, it's really good to have the enthusiasm to see things on site and to have the flexibility there. But what you want in this process is to make sure you know what effects that change has, how it's going to be paid for, how that then builds itself into the program that's already established, and how the contractor manages their time in regards to that. So those are the three distinct roles. The client employer has that specific power in terms of making the decisions and paying. The contract administrator assesses claims, issues instructions. So if it's all agreed by all parties that something should be added, that process of recording and adjustment is there in the middle. And then the contractor can go about their business to do that, to meet the expectations and to manage the site accordingly. You know, one of the biggest examples that we've got in terms of things that can really start to get things murky is you're on site and you're talking to the contractor there and you're really eager, and the contractor is showing you around, but you're say looking at your bedroom and you're thinking this is a bit small. And you just go to the contractor, maybe move that internal wall slightly, and they would be more than happy to agree to that. But what you've agreed to has specific domino effect. This can adjust the electrics, this can adjust the plasterboard, this can adjust where structure's lining through, and all of that needs to be assessed and controlled in terms of the confirmations. For example, that if it does have an effect to that, especially when it comes to structure, there's a cost and time associated with that to make sure that you're not causing undue damage. There's safety, there's compliance to think about. So if there's no clear record of what has changed, why that has changed, and what costs have been agreed to it, then there's knock-on effects, and this can also lead to dispute. So what contract administration does is it takes away the ambiguity. And that's essentially what this process de-risks. So what you see in a building contract, many there are many, many forms. There's a lot of standard contracts available out there. The most popular, especially in a domestic setting, are standard forms from the Joint Contract Tribunal, the JCT, or RIBA. They have their own catalogue, and they can be quite daunting. There's a lot of legal jargon in them, more so in the JCT than the RIBA stuff, because they like to tailor it more towards domestic clients, so they can see the process easier in those. But there's a lot of decisions prior to what you choose as a contract, that kind of leads you in the right direction. But essentially the format stays pretty much identical. And it's really good for fixing information, which allows for variation and things to be catalogued afterward, because you've got that baseline. So in your main contract that you see that you have to sign and things like that, you have the parties, the project details. This will contain all the requirements that you want to achieve. You'll have the contract sum, you'll have the payment rules, and you'll have a set program, and then you have all the conditions attached to that. Every contract will have their own method of how the CA instructs, how variations are administered, what provisional sum process entails, and there'll be set timeframes within that, and it works in quite a cyclical nature. And obviously at the end of every contract you have termination and dispute processes. So everything is set out in a clear, fixed form, but you shouldn't think of it as one document. Most of the time you see the signed agreement that can contain the rules, conditions. If you have bespoke ones that the contractor agrees with, then you should always look into those, and you can tailor things. We would always recommend that before you're signing a legal agreement that you get consultation from a legal professional. That's one of our main recommendations. However, you should see it as a block of documents, and usually they're in a share file that then everybody can access and everyone can take a look at, and that's where the clarity comes into things. So most of the time there'll be a reference annex, the contract documents will be part of that. So what the architect would do before you get into the construction side of things is there will be a mass package of drawing documentation, specifications. If you've got a contractor involved early, there may already be a pricing document, but that can also be procured through a QS. It can be procured through multiple methods, and essentially your requirements as a client as to what is being done, and that is the bulk information within a contract. So choosing the right family of contract is definitely an important decision. Most domestic contracts are in the form of what you see on the screen right now. Design and build each contract has a variance in liability and what roles and responsibilities are, and they do sometimes are heavy in the legal jargon, but essentially your design team will have these conversations prior to going on site. If you've got a contractor involved, they'll also be involved with that too. And it's important for you to have this conversation with your design team in terms of what you're willing to take on from a risk and liability perspective, and how you would then want to field that to somebody else. And that's basically the essential decision component of which contract you would want to enter into. And it's almost the same process with a contractor. You have to also see if they'd be happy to do that too. So for a JCT design and build, you're taking away your control a little bit over the design process, and the contractor's got more of that responsibility. Whereas if you're looking at domestic contracts and homeowner contracts, it's very traditional, where you and your architect are working to compile that, and you're giving the information to the contractor, which they then follow. So there's more of a risk on that for you. But if you have the right professionals involved, then it's clearly defined, then you have, especially with self-builders, more variation, more flexibility in terms of how something gets constructed. So the best protection in all routes of contract and contract administration is the amount of fixed information you can provide. So this is prior to construction. You'd be working a lot with your architect and various consultants to procure the information that's needed to price something up, to figure out how long it's going to take to build, and how one element might affect another. For example, your MVHR routes affecting structure and vice versa. So with the drawing package, you would, if it's not detailed enough, then you're relying on, oh, the builder knows what that means, and that can lead to uncoordinated issues. So there could be then more revisions on top of that because the builder hasn't made an allowance within their costing and their time frame for something that is needed in order to construct that specific element. It's not just cost, it's just the lack of detail can mean that the specification isn't meeting something that you need from an aesthetical strategy point of view, or a heating system point of view, or a finishing point of view. It's all got a domino effect, and therefore, if it's a little bit muddy, who's responsible for that? Is it a cost on the client? Is it a cost on the contractor? And what that does is it weakens the control in regards to managing genuine changes, and what's simply just not been given right at the beginning. And it's the same with the specification documents and pricing documents, and it does stem a lot from the drawings. So the more information you have fixed within the specification and the drawings, the more detailed a pricing quote will be. So you're not just looking at, oh, that seems like a reasonable overall cost. You're going into the nuance. You're seeing the quantities, you're seeing breakdowns, you're seeing exactly what's included and excluded, and what is up for finalization during the build. So provisional sums essentially are that. It's when you want the flexibility in order to have a bit more choice on finishes or any other specific element, that you're more than happy to have a bit more of a collaborative atmosphere with the contractor on. So they would put some assumptions in, they would have a quotation for it, but it's subject to finalization, and therefore at least it's listed when it comes to contract admin that is something that can vary, and therefore you can place controls in effectively on that, and it's less muddy when it comes to finalizing that, and it reduces the amount of delayed decisions because you, from the get-go, you can place a parameter on that aspect on when it needs to be finalized and controlled as part of the original agreement. And this is really important for the program as well, because this allows a contractor to place in those, usually in a request for information. They can build that into the project program. You can keep a delay record. So if you have a set target in mind with all of these established beforehand, you're more likely to meet that. And if you don't, there's parameters in place that defines the responsibilities as to why that's not being met and what we can do to mitigate those. And with that record, it's much easier to establish how you can resequence, how you can budget the uncertainty, and where something can be solidified. It just reduces the amount of disputes. So the last bit is about design rules. And if you're eager to get on site, and if you've got a massive target in mind that you want to, if the contractor is more than happy to take that on, you can define that as part of the contract as well. So if they have a roofer and they want to specify that up and they want to take design control over that, you can have that in writing. You can make sure that they are responsible in a defined way for the design calculations and drawings behind that, as well as the building regulation approval. So those are all things that you can do pre-construction start as you agree in this contract, for things to have a specific role attached, for people to have that liability on them for their role, and what that does in terms of sequencing, contract rules, production, and how that all fits in together, and it's recorded and it's written, and it's something that you can constantly refer back to. If all of this isn't fixed beforehand, then you just up the liability in terms of cost, delay, and disagreement. And that's the main triangle that this management tool tries to balance as effectively as possible, is those three things: is cost, quality, and time. So the pricing document is the baseline. It provides you with the quantities, the specification, or the prices behind certain specifications, what's excluded, what each individual element would take to build in terms of time and complexity, and then how each aspect of the build is going to be priced, and what comes first in terms of the sequencing. So the contract control allows for applications for payments, inspections, valuations, and it certifies what's being built. So throughout the process, this pricing document is constantly referred back to in terms of project program, drawings. It's not just simply a tender comparison tool when you're looking at multiple main contractor options. It is basically the bill of quantity for the level of detail that you need. And therefore, if you do want to add things on, it's something that you can make sure is not already included and build off of when it comes to changes and general progress claims. What typically happens through the construction is a set inspection date is agreed to within the contract. A payment application is made a specific amount of time before that to allow the CA to then come onto site, take a look around, quantify what they're applying for against this pricing document, and certify that that's adequate. And that keeps the control on cash flow, but also workmanship, employers' requirements, and anything that's not been dealt with. So it allows for that process of fairness in terms of contractors getting paid for what they've done, but you're making sure that what's been agreed to is also being built. And that happens live. So you're getting a percentage of money taken off of the original contract sum once it's been certified, so you know exactly what level of progress you've gone through. If there's any changes attributed to that, they'll have their own marker, and that will have a forecast onto what's been added on as well as what's been taken off. And then you'll have your retention, your contingencies, and the outstanding risks that remain on the project program. So once this cycle or baseline starts, it's a constant reference tool to make sure that you can get through what you need to and what might be delayed or at risk, but everything is evidenced. Oh, I've gone back, sorry. An example of this is, this is a window detail. So when you see that information, it's been fully coordinated. So you've got thresholds, you've got a drainage strategy, you've got your structural strategy on how the windows fit, you've got your aesthetical strategy in terms of how the corners work, how the soffits work. So the soffits are angled to reduce the roof edge depth and not compromise on the structure. And it's got a very minimalist aesthetic. So if you're on site and you want to see that, but you're wanting to move that column out of the way, how does that process get administrated, and who's responsible for that? So most of the times, roles are very important in terms of effectively monitoring this to completion. What a contract administration does is it allows for what's been built to be claimed for, but it also allows for time for things to be explored from a consultant point of view. So you've got your structural engineer coming in to decide on what's required, what time that then adds on for the contractor in terms of, do they need to take anything out? Do they need to then replace something? Which is also why you need fixed information from the beginning, because if this is a pretty major change. So if you do then decide for no change to happen, then you've allowed for that process to be recorded and things can get sorted out quickly. And there's the finishing product. When it's finished, you don't really see the column there, but if you're trying to make that variation through the contract process, then you've got a lot of domino effect in there. And without that recorded, without that process of elimination and omission and that tracking of how this affects the principal timeline, then everything becomes muddy and it can lead to dispute, and the contractor may feel that they've not been adequately reimbursed for anything that they've had to take out throughout that. And everything then leads to a specific type of litigation, which is what everybody wants to avoid. And this is getting into the financial oversight and how we manage this within the contract administration side of things. So a clear payment cycle within a contract is you have an application for payment set out by the contractor. It breaks down exactly what's been popped in at that specific point of the project program. You get, for example, a quantity of structure, who's come onto the site, if there's a subcontractor involved, what they've done. You then have an assessment period where the CA the contract administrator will come onto site, check the progress against that, check the progress against the pricing document to make sure that the application is valued as per the agreement. So the pricing document usually has rates. It'll have a contractor overhead attached to it, things like that. So you have these reference points as a tool and management mechanism, which is what we use to assess and certify payments. And if there's anything omitted, if there's anything that they've claimed for that isn't present, that can be taken off during the certification process. That can then be reevaluated and assessed at a different cycle. But we also record the site, we'll take visual inspections, and we can then instruct if there's any defects as well, especially when it comes to compliance concerns. And after the assessment process, we go through the certification. So we will write down and record what amount has been agreed, what amount can be paid by the client, what specific part of that is then included within retention, and what sums are removed because they either haven't been built or they're defective. And therefore, there's a payment attached to that. So once the certification has been given, it's usually in the form of an official letter or note. There's a cycle of days where the client then has to pay that once that amount's been certified. And the client has control over whether or not they agree with what the assessment says. And there's procedures in place within the contract to allow for that too. And that cycle just repeats throughout the entire timeline of the project. So what you should see is something very transparent. You should see what's being claimed. There should be evidence behind that. And if anything's not been allowed for, you should also be able to see why that has been the case also. And the contractor receives that predictability in terms of cash flow, fair assessment. So anything that we evidence is not just evidence for the client, it's evidence for the contractor as well. And it just provides that added level of discipline in terms of how something is assessed through the process. And it's very much the same and cyclical with variations as well. If you identify a need, or the contractor identifies a need, it's usually a case of them coming to the CA to talk about it. If there's a notice of delay, things like that, and we can record that in terms of whether or not it's something to just be monitored or something that needs to be explored further, and what can be instructed immediately or not. And with that, there's a process in terms of what information needs to be gathered, what is impacted, what's the statutory requirements behind something significant like a window change or a roof specification update, what hasn't been seen in the initial discussions. There's a process and a time attributed to that, and therefore we can then generate a clear record of what that's going to do to the project program and what that's going to do to the price and who's responsible for that, whether or not it's a delay on the contractor or whether or not it's a delay by the client. And therefore there's a clear route and justification for that. And what we do at the end is it's accepted, it's logged, it's numbered, and then it's linked in to the ever updating reference point and baseline program. And it just repeats the same way again whenever something arises that can be changed. But the danger is you don't want to have something done prior to this process unfolding with no variation or valid instructions. It's not clear who's responsible for what, and there's a lot of risk associated with that. So a danger phrase is, we've already done it because you asked us on site. How do we know if that wasn't already included within the pricing document? How do we know what the individual elements are that create the whole and how that's been costed and what charge is involved with that and what time's involved with that? Another danger phrase is, we'll sort the cost out later. I mean, that's a very difficult reference in terms of the labor charges, the individual elements, what is actually practical. If there's any efficiencies that can be made, there's the risks in elements like that. Another one is, yeah, that wasn't included in my price. Again, if your pricing document isn't clear enough and your exclusions and emissions aren't something that can be referenced and look back to, then there are clarifications that become muddy in regards to that. So having somebody like a contract administrator in place to identify where that stands is really important. So like I've been saying throughout this talk, is you've got your baseline, you have the delays, you have any changes, then you have the evidence, and then you have your decision windows. And that is essentially what the management tool does. It's a program control, and everything is clear, concise, noted down, recorded, monitored. So other aspects of control that help in terms of exclusions and security and de-risking things is the retention sum. So not everything is included within retention. Usually if you're purchasing something directly but you want the contractor to then implement, or you're paying deposits, or you're looking for a consultant to be working underneath the main contractor, these are usually not retainable items, and it's up to the contract administrator as well as yourselves and the contractor to agree on what defines retainable elements at the beginning, so that you've got that process to refer back to, and then whatever does get included within the retention is something that can be tracked. But a retention is a mechanism that holds back a defined percentage of elements during the construction, that it helps with allowing for completion. And if anything does arise, then you have that pot there that can be used in the defects correction period, whether it be you choosing to go a separate way with the chosen contractor and bring someone else in. It provides that cap that allows for correction, but it also allows for completion as well in terms of agreed sums. And what we do is we'll make sure that everything is stated, everything is defined, what's excluded is clear, and that every valuation shows what's being added to that pot. So at the end of the contractual process, a release of that gets triggered for the contractor. And then when your defects liability period starts, there's still a sum of money left in there for that to be fixed. So where things go wrong, this is the last element of the presentation, is where gaps and information can cause a problem and behaviours throughout the construction process. So common failures are starting too early. And we're all very familiar with a contractor coming to us to say, we have this slot, we'd like to get going. But if your drawings and your specification and the program are not fixed to sufficient standard, there's not enough detail to refer back to, and therefore responsibility and mechanisms in place can become muddy and disputes can arise. So setting out important controls reduces this, and starting too early can really stop that process from happening. So another one is the blurred client route, and unfortunately this does happen quite a bit, where the client can give instructions on site and it bypasses the CA or the agreed approval process, and therefore nothing is getting noted, referenced, costed appropriately, and then added succinctly into the project programme and contract value. And then when it comes to the contractor claiming for this cost, the client doesn't have a clear evaluation of what the overall sum of that is, how much it's going to affect their timelines, and the contractor doesn't necessarily know if the client's not going to change their mind and then refuse that work. Another problem is provisional sums. If there's too many of those, things can become very unclear in terms of detail, logistics, how this fits in sequentially, because there can be mass amounts of variation when it comes to that in the finalizing of that. It also means that if you have lots of provisional sums and you've set parameters on when they need to be confirmed, there must be strict accordance with that, because if something slips, then multiple other provisional sums can slip too. And therefore, you basically have a rolling snowball effect as to what a reliable budget looks like and what a reliable program will look like. And poor record keeping can be one thing that can derail the administrative route. If meetings and decisions aren't clearly recorded, if nothing is confirmed off the back of those, if we're not tracking delays and variations appropriately, and everything is being discussed verbally and not captured, then confusion can arise, or something gets slipped through the cracks and has to then be dealt with as it becomes emergent, and therefore you're reducing time to properly scope out the effects. Paying ahead of the value is also another risk of derailment, because that is not fixed. If you don't have a record of the final cost, if you don't have a record of what exactly is contributing to it in terms of elements, construction materials, consultant costs, then you're losing track of that fixed sum, which is what this management tool is used to try and control, and you're not getting the same amount of evidence behind that as well. So there has to be a clear distinction between what can be variable and what can't when it comes to paying ahead of value, and that needs to be set out clearly too in writing so that it reduces disputes. And number 6 is no completion discipline. So you've reached practical completion, half of the retention's been provided to the contractor, the defects liability period starts, and you're getting it into the final accounts and handover of information, but things aren't set on a time scale, things aren't set to be recorded in a specific way, that then just continues and continues and continues. And you don't have a hard line, or you see an end. There's no light at the end of the tunnel. So if you do get into a situation where you're getting pressured by the contractor and they're urging for prices or commitment, what the CA can do is, if it's time sensitive, we can record that, we can see what the risks are, assess what needs to be done now and what needs to be tracked. And if it's incomplete, then there's power to instruct the need for further information. So if they're saying something's fixed for a week and you have to make that decision urgently, then meetings should be had. It's not as if we shouldn't be treating it as strong as it is, but there is a process that protects that within a contract, and therefore the mechanisms reduce that pressure slightly, because the contractor knows this, you know this, so we can make some time-sensitive decisions in a recorded way that helps things. And it's the same with most of the quotes that you see on this table. There are adequate measures put in place at the beginning that we have then tracked throughout the process, and we can define and provide instruction on relatively quickly based on how things have unfolded. And that's what creates a healthy construction environment, and it develops those boundaries. So you've got timely selections, you're attending progress meetings, you're involved, but you're understanding things from a clear, concise line of reference. You've understood the budget decisions, you've understood the variations, you've seen clearly how this affects the overall values and timescales, and you can make approval decisions with much more evidence at your back and clarity that protects the investment, because you're deeply investment. It's your home, it's your money. So this helps to de-risk things incredibly early. So the risky parts are, like I've mentioned, informal instruction, bypassing these routes, not allowing them to be tracked, and then dealing with coordination out with the mechanisms is essentially what can muddy the waters and then create a tunnel that you then have to navigate through in the dark a little bit. So when these conflicts arise, you've got conflict resolution strategies in place within the contract, and a good CA separates the person from the problem. So we have a record. This is the contractual route. This is what we can decide based off of that agreement. So when there's clarity, you can understand exactly what's being disputed, the scope, the quality, the cost, time, payment, or responsibility based off of that. There's evidence. You've got the contract documentation, there's drawings, there's emails, there's photographs, there's minutes, and there's valuations onto that. And therefore, there's an easier route to establish where to go. Most contracts have a very clear and defined mechanism for a multitude of things when it comes to changes, progress, extensions of time. That's what the contract mechanisms are for, and the CA just allows that process to be maintained and continued. And you can then use that to have successful meetings, to decide and action things, and to place target deadlines on. And it really does mitigate things escalating. There are processes in place for mediation and adjudication when either party feels that this isn't working and it's against the routes that have been defined. And that is when you seek legal advice, and the process is then getting an independent adjudicator in for that to discuss through those things. But that typically doesn't happen unless all works have started and you've reached a force majeure and things have escalated past the point of all of the record keeping. So protection behind the main contract. This is pretty much a little bit separate from contract administration, but it's a useful tool of information to know, especially if you're working with a main contractor, what guarantees can be in place. So there are things like collateral warranties, especially with a self-builder working with a main contractor. If there's a subcontractor involved, for example, main contractor appoints a specialist timber supplier, waterproofing designer, M&E designer. There are agreements that you can enter into that protect your investment on that. So if a defect later appears and the main contractor is no longer trading, or the client have a limited or direct contractual right with that specific specialist, then a collateral warranty can create a direct contractual link between the client and that third party, confirming that the works that have been carried out, have they done with the appropriate skill and care? And if not, then you have a process to then claim back a specific amount of your investment on that. And it's the same with if you're buying a product outright, they usually have insurance-backed guarantees with this. For example, your windows, your roof membrane, waterproofing all have their own forms of insurance. Workmanship and defects are typically insured buyback guarantees as well from the contractor's perspective. And your design team and the contract administrator can talk you through that at the agreement stage on what you want to protect and what you value most in terms of those mechanisms. And these can also be added into the contract documentation as a part to reassure you. And it's the same with vesting certificates. If you're buying a specific window, if you've got a kitchen that's coming in and it needs to be stored on site, or it's with a different supplier than the main contractor, you can identify those goods as yours. So if anything happens, that company becomes insolvent, you are confirming ownership and you have that paid for. And those items are stored for you before delivered to the project. But if anything happens, you've got those. So your goods are insured, they're stored safely and correctly. Your rights are protected under any kind of liquidation or insolvency aspects. And then you've got a legal route forward if anything needs to be enforced. So that's what you kind of need to go through in terms of protection in regards to domestic builds. Is you've got your before contract element, you've got your deposits, your pricing document, your genuine cash flow with the contractor, and then you're protecting yourself against anything that they would bring in from a subcontractor, any other aspects of design, product procurement, and then you're going into the completion in regards to all of those aspects too. If you have any questions in regards to today's talk, we've got a lot of literature in terms of what can be offered in education terms, and just getting you a little bit more acquainted with what a contract can look like. You've got RIBA, you've got the RIB stages of work, so it sets out a flow of design through to construction and completion, and JCT have sample contracts on their website as well. So there's a lot of resources to utilize in terms of wrapping your head around it, because it is a very big topic. And does anyone have any questions?
Thanks very much for that, Rachel. That was amazing. It went through, I think you really simplified it for people, which is good, because it is a big topic, and it's a topic that for people who've been spending the last 9 months looking at design ideas and construction systems, to now be thinking about how it actually all goes into place and how to communicate throughout that. It's a completely different set of skills. So
yeah, and in terms of contracts, they are very unique and bespoke. So if anyone is confused by what's being said, it's probably easier for me to take someone one-on-one and go through a specific storyline, and provide guidance and recommendations based off of that, because there is so many different routes, there's so many different aspects to how you go about this. But essentially the main objectives to take out of this is you have options in terms of managing your investment. This is one of them, and there's multiple different looks that can be in.
So for someone who maybe hasn't instructed CA for their project, or is not sure if they can afford it, or nervous, whatever the reasonings are behind it, or just thinks they can do it, who would be presenting that initial contract? Is it usually then the client? Is it the contractor? Or does it just get missed out? if someone's not paying attention and they just get the quote and say, great, proceed.
So it can be quite a collaborative process. You typically do have an architect involved making recommendations on this process, but you could also have a project manager in line from an early stage. You could even have a preferred contractor in mind at an early stage, and it can then evolve from there as to who the CA is and what kind of contract you're entering into. For the most part, it does end up being the designer, because we can then manage the workmanship aspects of the inspections and valuations. But it could also be a quantity surveyor, because they can also be involved from a tender point onwards to make sure that, you know, the drawings have a quantity assigned to them, and that can then be monitored. So it's up to what you value most, and that can then decide who your CA is and what contract you go into and what the procurement looks like. If you're prioritizing time, it may be best to get a QS and then get the bill of quantities done, set the information from the start, get your contractor and go. If you're looking for something more flexible, a bit more traditional, you can, I mean, the architect can do the time value as well, but the quality and cost is another part of the triangle to consider. And therefore, who do you want in terms of the management tool prioritizing in that triangle of aspects? And that's usually what decides the route and the CA.
And we've thrown around quite a few acronyms.
Yeah.
So I'm going to name 3: QS, PM, and CA. Can you just, and people may know what they mean or may know what they stand for, but may not understand the difference between them. Can you give sort of a 30-second blurb on each of them? And
so the QS is the quantity surveyor, and they can act as contract administrator, which is CA as well. What were the other ones?
So, but their main role is.
Oh, yeah. The QS, the main role is the financial aspect, to make sure you've got quantities and prices and rates attributed correctly. Some main contractors have their own in-house QS, and they can provide that documentation. But if you're wanting that added security, you could get a professional quantity surveyor in to either evaluate and review or generate their own based off of the design drawings and specification document that the architect provides.
Yeah. And then the other 2 were CA, which we've just spent the entire time talking about. So I don't think we need to define that. But then PM, what's the difference between a project manager, a QA, quantity surveyor? I know I talk to a lot of people who always sort of, they're not quite sure where the separation is.
Yeah, so a PM is a project manager, and they typically can act as the contract administrator as well, as long as they're competent enough to be able to evaluate what is being built effectively against the drawings and the pricing document. But a project manager also helps with the project program more so than a contract administrator does. So they would be involved in the development of the project program, what the deliverables are, what the timescales and logistics look like behind that, and then they create the project program essentially based off of what's required from a client's perspective more so than the contractor's perspective, and then they work with the contractor throughout the contract in order to make sure that that's deliverable. But what the CA does is they can be involved with the production of a project program, but when it isn't a project manager and they're not looking to manage that deliverable aspect, it's led by the contractor and just becomes part of the contract, and that gets monitored and adjusted according to changes and variances like delays, for example.
Amazing. Well, thank you very much, Rachel. That was really informative. I'm going to finish off with just a few top takeaways that I've recorded during the presentation. And then we'll close out. So my top takeaways are, first of all, just what contract admin is. Contract admin is really a tool that helps you protect your investment. You can think of your contract as a construction manual used to guide you throughout the project. A good contract administrator removes ambiguity from the project. And this is because fixing items ahead of the contract is really going to limit additional costs, delays, disagreement throughout the construction process, which is where sort of arguments and tension often arise. And finally, don't proceed with variation until it is formally defined and accepted. It's really easy to sort of want to keep things moving and say, oh, just take care of that. But there's some dangers in that. So thank you all very much for joining us once again this month. So we're going to take a little bit of a break as we normally do in August. There will be no self-build hour. And as you can see from some of the upcoming events, the summer months tend to be a little bit quieter. We're still here. So you can still be in touch with us. But if you want to come see us in person, there are some upcoming events in the autumn. So the NSBRC have their autumn show on the 9th and 10th of October. And then we've got a few self-build seminars that we are hosting coming up. One in Scotland on the 13th of November. It's Friday, I believe. And then one in Swindon at the NSBRC on the 21st of November. Finally, when we do come back in September, we're starting sort of a multi-part series. So it's going to start with just an overview of construction systems, low energy systems. And then the months that follow that, we're going to do a really deep dive into those individual mostly offsite manufactured construction systems. So we look forward to you joining us then in the autumn term in school mode in the autumn, and until then, please feel free to reach out with any questions you might have, or go back and look at some of our previous episodes. Thank you very much.